Chapter 5, Part 2. David turned away, and the two boys left him sitting there. And when they turned around farther down the valley, they saw a great puff of white smoke going up. The fire was being put out. It was still a long walk back to the farm, an hour at least, and all that time they talked about what they should do. Every instinct, except one, told them to give the Germans up, to call in the soldiers, to tell Mr. Reynolds. After all, wouldn't Anne and Mr. Reynolds be pleased? Wouldn't the laughing faces in the village be silenced? Wouldn't their stock be high at school? And wouldn't everyone have to eat the words about the townies? And apart from that, they were Germans, enemies. It was a duty to make sure that they were captured. It was Tucky who did most of the talking. He kept on reminding David that the German had saved his life, that you couldn't turn on someone who had saved your life, no matter who he was. But David was determined. He would tell Mr. Reynolds as soon as they got back and leave it to him. By the time they reached the cottage, he was longing to break the news. Anne met them at the door. "Where have you been, you two? I was worried." Then she caught sight of David's clothes. "Davy, what has happened?" She reached out and felt his shirt. "It is damp. What has happened?" "I fell in the river," David started to explain. "We'd almost given up, Anne. We were crossing the river and I fell in. I slipped on the rocks and then... lucky I was with him, Anne. I can tell you, the river wasn't that fast and it's not too deep there either. Still, it's lucky I was with him." Tucky smiled up at Anne. David was about to interrupt, but Tucky went on before he had the chance. "And he can't swim. No, he slipped on the rocks and I leapt in after him and I fished him out. Where's a kipper he was? No doubt about it. Anyway, it was lucky I was there." And he preened himself, flashing a grin at David, and went into the cottage. It was a brilliant performance. David just stood there, gaping after him. He had known Tucky a very long time, and Tucky had never surprised him before. That's what he liked about Tucky. He could always tell what Tucky was thinking and what he was going to do. Until now, that is. Anne put an arm around his shoulder. "Are you all right, Davy? You still look as if you've seen a ghost. Are you cold still?" "Yeah, I'm cold," was all he could say. There was a steaming hot bath and a tea in the kitchen, and then Anne went off to help Mr. Reynolds with the milking. It was the first time the boys had been left alone, the first chance they'd had to talk. David didn't waste any time. We said we must tell them." "I never agreed anything," said Tucky, ready for him. "You tell them if you like, but I can tell you, if someone had just risked his own life to save mine, I wouldn't kick him in the teeth. German or not, doesn't matter." But we can't, Tucky. We can't help Germans to escape. It's not right. We're supposed to be fighting them. We can't." "Like I say," said Tucky firmly, "you owe them. And what's more, you know you do. All he's asking is for some food and some blankets. If you don't think that's a fair exchange for saving your life, then I think it's a pity he went in after you." David had never heard Tucky like this. He was excitable, yes. Impetuous, yes. But he'd never found him determined or single-minded. Tucky leaned towards him over the kitchen table. "I like you, Davy. We've been best friends ever since I can remember. You always seem to do right by people. You've done right by me, being a real friend since we left home. But if you turn those Germans in just because of your father..." "My father?" "Well, that's what it is, Davy, isn't it? And maybe Anne's as well. They're Germans. And all the Germans killed your dad. So hate all of them, don't you? Hate every single one of them." There was not a single word Tucky had spoken that David could argue with. Tucky was right. He did owe the Germans out on the moor. "All right," he conceded. "We'll do it, but not for long." Tucky smiled like his old self for the first time since they had got back. They didn't see Mr. Reynolds again that evening. He was busy fencing at the bottom of Front Meadow. But next morning over breakfast, before David and Tucky left for school, he heard all about their search on the moor. "So, you found nothing?" He smiled wildly. "And David here fell in the river?" I slipped, Mr. Reynolds. The stones were all slimy." "You crossed at the stepping stones, like I said?" "Yes, Mr. Reynolds." "No sign of that plane?" "Nothing," said Tucky. We must have made a mistake. Perhaps it went up again, behind a hill or something. We just didn't see it. We're sorry, Mr. Reynolds. Never you mind, my dear. You were right to tell us if you thought you'd saw it. Everyone makes mistakes. Anyway, it was good practice for the army and for us, even if no one enjoyed it much. We won't mention it again. Now off you go. You'll be late for school. School was still buzzing with the Townies' shot-down bomber, and David and Tucky longed to blurt out their secrets. Haven't you found it yet, Davy boy? Look out, the Germans are about. And whenever Mr. Cooper wanted someone with a good imagination, he turned to the Townies with a knowing smile, and everyone laughed. It was a wretched day, only made bearable by the knowledge that they knew they were right. On the way back home that afternoon, they worked out a plan. Whatever happens, Mr. Reynolds and Anne must never find out. Never. Nothing will be missed, said David. But what about the blankets? They'll miss those, won't they? They're bound to. Not if we take 2 off our beds, said David. We make our own beds, don't we? No one will miss them except us, and we can bring them back after they've gone. No one need notice. What about the food then? There's eggs. David had it all thought out. We can get them from the chicken hut as soon as we get back. Then there's carrots and radishes in the vegetable patch. I've seen Anne pulling them up often enough. I know where they are. That wouldn't be enough. Then there's that bowl of bread and leftovers that Anne keeps on the window ledge above the sink. We could take that, some of it anyway. No one would miss it, except the pigs, of course. David had been planning it all day, and once they got home, he knew exactly what had to be done. He sent Tucky upstairs for the blankets while he went for the food. As expected, Anne was out with Mr. Reynolds haymaking across a stream by Long Close. It was far enough away from the house for it to be safe. They wrapped the food in one of the blankets and made off out of the back door and over the fields across the moors. Once off the farm, they kept to the cover of the hedgerows until they reached the open moor and were out of sight of the cottage. Tucky flopped down behind a stone wall and waited for David to join him. He fought to catch his breath, hanging his head back and taking in great gulps of air. David slumped down next to him and checked that the food was still inside the blankets. One egg had broken, but everything was there. It was then they heard someone coming up the track behind them. They looked at each other in alarm. The panting was close now, just the other side of the stone wall. They froze against it, rigid and frightened. And then Jip came lolloping into sight. Saw them cowering there and trotted over, tail wagging, tongue hanging down from his pink mouth, and they laughed themselves silly with relief. Dogs can't tell tales, David said, and Jip followed them along over the hills to where the river rumbled over the rocks. They crossed over the stepping stones and clambered on up, always looking ahead to see if the Germans were still there. They approached the place slowly, but Jip ran on ahead, sniffing the ground busily, alternatively growling and yapping in excitement. He disappeared behind the stone wall, and then there was silence. The German airmen were where they had been left, only closer in amongst the rocks. One of them held Jip in his arm, his hand clamped over his muzzle. Both wore their green greatcoats and were crouching down low. Their faces relaxed, and the black revolver that was pointing at the boys was relaxed. "Is this your dog?" he asked. David nodded, and the Germans released Jip and patted his neck gently. Jip sprang away and cowered behind the boys. "Food. Have you brought food?" David handed over the blanket, and the 2 Germans spread it out carefully in front of them. They divided it equally and devoured it like starved dogs, looking up from time to time as if someone might take it away from them. The boys looked on in silence, wondering how anyone could be that hungry. They ate everything and anything: meat, fat, cold porridge, stale bread, vegetable peelings, carrots, raw eggs. When they had finished, not a crumb had been left on the blankets, except the eggshells. They sat back against the wall, breathing deeply. That was good. Very good. The airman was panting. "Gertie, he hardly slept at all. It would be good for him. You are kind, very kind. Thank you. It was a feast, a real feast." The boys saw that the men had built themselves a rough shelter up against the wall since the day before. It was made of wooden supports and covered in bracken, dried grass and freshly cut turf. There was more bracken on the floor inside, and enough room for both men to squeeze in together. "It's not a palace, my young friend," he said, "but it's better than nothing." The German smiled quietly as he spoke, but then his face altered suddenly. They all heard it together, the drone of an aeroplane. It was coming closer all the time. The two Germans crawled in under the shelter and pulled the blankets in after them. Tucky spotted it first as it came over the hill. A single-engine spotter plane, a biplane, and it flew down towards them over the moor. Its RAF markings plainly visible. It was a spotter plane that's been used in the search the week before. The end.